it's overrated. These expectations, they keep weighing me down. My heart is begging me to get the hell out of my head. I'm trying to live inside the upside down.
Well, yeah, the kind of physics that I'm studying, well, let me start the timer, because otherwise I forget how much time I've spent talking about things. Yeah, okay. So the kind of physics I'm studying is the physics of the early universe. And in this sort of small presentation, I'll keep it very brief, I kind of want to give you like a bit of a feeling for what is the physics of the early universe, what we try to study, what are the phenomena involved, and so on and so forth. It's also meant to be a very interactive kind of presentation. So whenever you feel like you have questions, just like raise your hand and ask whatever you want to ask. If it sounds stupid, do ask these questions, because usually they're the very important ones. So yeah, let's start. So first of all, I want to just tell you a little bit, sorry for the wiggly images, what the early universe is, and how do we define the early universe, and in general, what's going on in the early universe. And then I will sort of try to motivate why we need to go beyond the standard model. So there are two current standard models, let's say. There's the standard model of cosmology, the one that tells you how the universe expanded, and so on and so forth. And there's a standard model of particle physics. But both of them fail when we look at the very, very early stuff in the universe. And then I will talk about two very important periods in this very brief phase, the first 3 seconds of existence of the universe, which are inflation and reheating. And then I will show you a couple of things that I've been doing in the past. So, first of all, what is the early universe? Well, I assume you've already seen this image because it's the one that is on Wikipedia. And it's just the history of the universe sort of portrayed in a nice and kind of very graphical way, okay? Yeah, we are there, so basically at the end of this big bell, or whatever it's called. And yeah, we can sort of put a bit of time scales on the evolution of the universe. So you know that the universe is roughly 14 billion years old. Yeah, million year more, million year less. But the thing is that there are two clear and distinct phases of the evolution of the universe. There is a late phase and there is an early phase. So late phase is lasting essentially for most of these 14 billion years. And it has to do mostly with gravity shaping the universe. So stars forming, galaxies forming, classes of galaxies forming, and so on and so forth. So this big structure formation going on. And you can see it here. You can see that, well, almost for all of this history, you can see structures of different kinds. You can see gas clouds, you can see stars forming, you can see galaxies, and so on. But that is not all of it. There is another big piece of the puzzle which comes into play in the early universe. So only the first 400,000 years after the beginning of the universe, after the Big Bang. And this is much crazier in terms of the things that can happen there. Because this picture is a bit, I think, misleading in some sense, because it's really good from the timescale perspective, but what is like 400,000 years with respect to 14 billion years? So it doesn't really give a sense for what is going on. So it's much better to have a look at the energy scales. And here you see what I'm talking about. So essentially, the late universe is, well, a slow, let's say, cooling of the universe. It cools about 4 orders of magnitude. It's a relatively steady and kind of, how can I say, long process. But what happens in the early universe is that you jump from Planck scale, so 10 to the 19 gigaelectron volts, the kind of energy scale that you find at the Big Bang, down to about 1 electron volt. So these are like 20-something orders of magnitude. So here's something like crazy is going on, something really beyond our current understanding of fundamental physics. Now, I've chosen this 1 electron volt point. Well, actually, this is what is used in literature as the boundary for what separates the early universe and the late universe. And this point is the production of the CMB. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the CMB. It's the cosmic microwave background radiation. Actually, I have a prop here that you can have a look at, because this is essentially what the CMB is. And the idea is that the CMB is a sort of wave of photons that is produced in the moment in which the primordial plasma that made up the universe becomes cool enough to form atoms. So in the plasma, we have 3 electrons, 3 protons, but then at some point, the temperature decreases enough so that these electrons and protons can bind together and start forming the first atoms. And this is the moment in which the photons that normally are just scattered around the plasma manage to like start to free stream, start to move freely throughout the universe, and we get this big wave of photons that is now what we see as the CMB. Okay? So this is a key point, because the CMB is a sort of like point of no return for photons. So with telescopes and radio telescopes and so on, we can observe everything that is in the late universe until the CMB. After the CMB, it's unobservable with photons. So we need some other kind of messengers, let's say, to get information about the early universe. And I will come back to this later on. So, once more, the late universe. I'm sure this is another very familiar graph to all of you. So this is the usual pie chart, right? So you have dark energy that you know makes up most of the energy density of the universe nowadays, about 70%. You know that there's dark matter that makes essentially some 25%, depending a bit on who you ask to, because there's a bit of a dispute. But yeah. Then there is some neutrinos, essentially, so some relativistic species. And then there is also normal matter. So all of the things that you learn from particle physics, essentially. All of the matter that can be explained via the standard model. So you see here that the two standard models I was talking about earlier sort of come together as a sort of unified theory that explains a lot of how the universe looks today. When I say a lot, I mean essentially this part, but it's still like really, really good. Now there's still like a lot of things that we do not know. So dark energy is still like a big unknown. At the same time, dark matter is still a big unknown. But these two paradigms are very, very powerful, are really, really powerful. And yeah, are probably two of the most successful theories ever devised by human beings. So yeah, we have to give credit to them. But there is a problem that both of these theories have some questions that they cannot answer. So we can start asking ourselves about pushing these theories a bit towards the edge. We can ask them questions about, for example, the nature of dark matter, for example, or the nature of dark energy. And these theories cannot really tell us anything. So in some way, cosmology just says, okay, dark matter and dark energy exist and they behave in a certain way from the cosmological perspective, but it does not tell us anything about what is the real structure of dark energy, what is the nature of dark matter. At the same time, there are also many other questions in cosmology that force us to go beyond that lambda CDM paradigm that I was showing you here. That is to say, for example, why is the universe flat? This is something that is told like over and over again, but why is the universe flat? Is there a reason for it? Is it just like a conspiracy of the numbers that brought the universe into being flat, or is there a more deeper reason? Another question is, for example, the CMB. The CMB shows like it's very homogeneous. Now, you don't see it here because this is an old map of the CMB, which is not very homogeneous, but the new ones are very homogeneous. And where does this homogeneity come from? And then there are also like deeper questions about the real physical theories that we're using. So GR, for example, is it good at very large scales? Is it good at very high energies? On the other hand, we have also questions that come from particle physics. So in particular, you can see that some of them sort of have a matching with the questions that we ask in cosmology. So I don't know, the nature of dark matter. So what is its particle nature? When was it produced? What was the process that could lead to the production of dark matter? And then you have other questions, such as, for example, the presence of antimatter in the universe that you know is pretty much inexistent, okay? So very low density of antimatter, but why is it so? If antimatter is just the mirror image of normal matter, why should there be less of it? And various other questions, such as the interactions between gravity and quantum fields. But all of this sort of tells us that we need to look beyond what the normal models describe, and we need to look into a regime that sort of combines all of these elements together. And the regime in which this happens is the early universe. Now, this is a bit of a better depiction of what the early universe looks like, because this shows a bit of different phases. It's terrible, I know, like the wiggling and so on, but bear with me. So this is time, okay. So this is 10 to the minus 40 seconds, okay, and this is nowadays, so 14 billion years after. What you see is that what is considered to be the early universe, or what I consider to be the first 3 seconds of existence of the universe, sort of ends about here. And the processes that are involved are, let's say, some of them are constrained, but most of them are not constrained. So there are lots of hypotheses going on in here into describing what happens in the first 3 seconds. Now, you might wonder why exactly these 3 seconds? What is so special about them? Well, the fact is that when we reach 3 seconds, well, here's 1 second, but it's scale, okay? Order of magnitude, let's say. That is the moment in which the universe finds itself in radiation domination. So if you know anything about cosmology, when you have radiation domination, essentially you go back to the paradigm I was showing you earlier. So after 3 seconds of existence, the early universe can be described by lambda CDM, the theory I was showing you earlier. But in the first 3 seconds, that theory is not enough. So in some way, we're trying to close this gap. We're trying to close this 3 seconds gap in our 14 billion years history. Okay, so many things going on. Yeah, you can go, of course, to very, very high energies, so towards Planck scale and so on. Yeah, this is what I was telling you earlier. After 3 seconds, the universe is dominated by radiation, so we go back to standard cosmology. But at the same time, we have so little knowledge about what is going on here, because essentially photons do not reach us. The only piece of information that we get is from the CMB. The CMB sort of brings and takes an imprint of what happens at very, very early stages of the evolution of the universe, but it's still a very limited amount of information. So here there's a lot of freedom. We can come up with many different ideas and many different theories about how to go beyond the standard model, how to include new pieces to the standard model of particle physics and the standard model of cosmology. All right, other questions? I'm sure I've thrown out there many ideas, and okay, think about them, and then at some point, whenever you want, you can ask. But yeah, here are 2 extremely important phases in those first 3 seconds. One of them is called inflation, and the other one is called reheating. And I'm sure you're really familiar with one of them because it's been in the news for many days by now, but it's not this. When we talk about inflation, we talk actually about cosmological inflation, okay? So if we have a look at the early, let's say, history of the universe, you see that just after the Big Bang, that is big expansion that is happening here. So inflation is just a theory that explains a very rapid exponential expansion of the universe at a very, very early time. Inflation is also one of those theories that are a bit of a miracle, meaning that with just one theory, you're able to solve many different problems. I was mentioning to you earlier the flatness problem, the homogeneity problem. Those are 2 of the many problems that inflation solves. Inflation, in some sense, tells us that the universe we live in is not a conspiracy of the numbers. It's not that the parameters have been chosen randomly and we end up in this universe. Inflation tells us that we can start with a wide variety of different initial conditions, but we will end up, in any case, into a universe that looks like the universe we're living in today. So it's a very powerful tool. Yeah, as I said, there's some data that can be gathered about inflation that comes from the CMB. Essentially, the fact is that inflation creates some quantum fluctuations, and these quantum fluctuations will then be, well, yeah, detectable essentially in the fluctuations that you see on the CMB. So this is a way to sort of go back to inflation. And what is the normal way to describe inflation? Well, it's usually this inflaton field. So what people say is that at the beginning of the universe, there is one field that is the dominating energy component. Essentially, in the early universe, you just have one field that describes all of the universe, essentially, all of the energy content of the universe. And this field has some particular behavior that allows it to trigger this exponential expansion of the universe. But what is important to know is that, okay, this field exists, it lasts, it exists for, okay, a fraction of a second, but it exists. But then at some point, we do not really see the inflaton field anymore. So we know that it must be there to trigger inflation, but then afterwards, we do not have proof of the existence of the inflaton field. So in some way, this field should decay or transform itself into other things. And in particular, we would like it to transform itself into the particles of the standard model, because that's what we see today. We see all the fields of the standard model. We do not see the inflaton field. And this is a subsequent problem, which is called reheating, right? You can understand very well what this is, because if you think about inflation, what I just told you, it's an exponential expansion of the universe. So you have, imagine you have like a gas in a box, okay? You expand the box exponentially fast. What happens? The box cools down, okay? So once you have a very cooled universe after inflation, you have to create particles such that you create a sort of primordial plasma. So you are reheating the universe, you're bringing the universe up to temperature. That's where the name comes from. All right, so reheating sort of sits between inflation and other periods of the evolution of the universe that we know better, such as the electroweak scales, or what happens at Big Bang nucleosynthesis, or the CMB, and so on. But reheating needs to be happening around at this stage. And it needs to fulfill, let's say, some requirements. These requirements are essentially two. The first one is that we want to produce particles. That is the most important one. And the second one is that we want these particles to thermalize. So we want the particles to create a plasma, which will be our primordial plasma, from which, all of the normal standard model stuff is going to come out eventually. So hadrons, and then atoms, and then so on and so forth until we reach, stars, galaxies, and what we see nowadays. So it's a sort of like, I don't know, the birthplace, if you want to say, of the elements and the constituents of our universe. There are some cool things going on during this reheating phase, because essentially I told you that inflation, well, we have some data about inflation, which is very interesting and very nice. So there are some constraints about it. But then the reheating phase is very much unknown. So we do not have any messenger that can tell us anything about what happened there. So these two conditions that I told you, this thermalization and production of particles, are just two, let's say, consistency checks. So we want to match what happens during inflation to what happens afterwards. And so we need these two conditions to be true. But we don't really have specific data that can tell us exactly what happened. One of the potential ways to let's say, investigate reheating is to study some alternative messengers, let's say, which are gravitational waves, for example, and also other things like, for example, magnetic fields that could potentially be produced during this period. All right, so this was more or less the setting. And yeah, this is more or less the area in which I work, in particular in reheating. That's why I liked it very much. And now I kind of want to show you a little bit the things that I'm doing, just to see, concretely what people can do. And this is the first thing. So stochastic background of gravitational waves. Now, I told you the gravitational waves are one of the potential messengers that we can use to probe this regime. And how is this possible? Well, if you know anything about gravitational waves, essentially, whenever you have a fairly random and non-symmetrical distribution of energy density in your system, then this is going to radiate some gravitational waves. It's just that you normally think of this as like, I don't know, two black holes rotating around each other. This is a different kind of situation. Okay, you have some kind of field that is distributed, has some kind of energy distribution, which is very inhomogeneous, and this creates essentially gravitational waves. So it's not just one signal, but it's a stochastic background. Yeah, and so for example, you can see here, this is a lattice simulation of a field that is growing and then oscillating and so on. This is just a field, it's not gravitational waves or anything. But here you can see how random and anisotropic it can be. And this is the key to essentially producing gravitational waves in the universe. There is another thing that I'm also working on. This is another cool thing that can happen during this reheating phase, which is a so-called formation of topological defects. And I don't know if you're familiar with topological defects in general, but I'm sure you've heard of it, because I'm sure you've studied, like when you have ferromagnets and you look at the microstructure of a magnet, and you see that there are like different patches where the magnetic field is oriented in different directions. Those are usually called domain balls, right? Well, actually domains, and then the border between two domains is called domain balls. This is essentially the same thing. So from the primordial universe, essentially, we have some fields that at some point cool down and they lock themselves in some specific configurations. And this will create like bubbles or like cells of fields at different configurations. And the sort of separating membrane between them, they're called domain walls. So here you can see a simulation of domain walls. So domain walls are the green things that you can see, and then the empty bits are the bubbles, the cavities, let's say, between two different, on either side of the domain wall. There are many, it's a very large subject. I mean, there are lots of different topological defects. You can have strings, you can have monopoles, you can have textures, a lot of different stuff, depending on the kind of symmetry that you break. But yeah, all of these phenomena produce also gravitational waves. So this is another source of gravitational waves that you can potentially observe. But I want to stress that I don't want to get your hopes too high, because these gravitational waves are probably not going to be detectable for the next like 50 years or so. So like forget about seeing them with LIGO or with one of those interferometers. Not even LISA probably is going to be able to observe these, because essentially the frequency is extremely, extremely low. That is the main problem. But it's a potential window into the early universe. All right, so, well, this was more or less the presentation I wanted to give you. So I hope you have more or less understood what the early universe is and where the early universe is, and actually when the early universe is, and the fact that the early universe can be like a big playground to play with extensions of the standard model of particle physics and of cosmology, put them together, see how gravity and particles interact with each other. Sure. Yeah. Then I talked a little bit about reheating, because that's what I'm working on, and the fact that it is a very unknown process. So if you have cool ideas that you want to test in an environment that is pretty much free, then reheating is the way forward, because really there's like no information about what it is. And then I talked also a little bit about gravitational waves, meaning that they could be like a really good probe of the early universe, but it's still a bit too soon to have them as a reliable source of information. And well, yeah, this was it. So if you have questions, just like throw them, like no problem at all. Yes?
So if I understood it correctly, when inflation, the inflation field broke down into the particle fields,
yep.
That created some domains, like in magnets. So do you think it would be possible for the inflation field to decay into different particle fields in different parts of the universe? So we could have like a batch of universe that has completely different rules?
Okay, yes and no. One of the hypotheses behind the inflaton field is that it has to be homogeneous. Oh. So by being homogeneous, it means that you create kind of the same kind of particles everywhere in the universe, right? But at the same point, this is a very tricky question, because how do you go from one single field to like a multitude of fields that you observe in the standard model? That is still not clear. There are toy models, and I'm actually working on this, toy models of like transforming the inflaton field into maybe one single like U1 gauge field, so like photons, for example, or SU2 fields, like, I don't know, electrons, something like this. But it's still very complicated. There's not a full picture of how this happens. Yeah. Yes?
You said before inflation, the photon field was the only field that there was, right? So,
yeah.
Were there any particles at all in that field that weren't in the particle, like in the standard model, or not at all?
Yeah, I mean, it could be a thing. It's it's difficult to say, you know. Also, the problem with the inflaton field is that you say, okay, it's the only field present. But one can see it a bit as an effective field theory kind of approach. So you don't know whether there was actually just one field or many fields, but for sure you know that that inflaton field is the one that dominates, okay? And then it could be that it decays, it produces some kind of other particles, there is some kind of weird interaction going on, and it transfers its energy to other particles. But that is, yeah, really open to, you know, new ideas, interpretations, and so on. Yeah.
Taking on that, currently, do we know where the inflaton field came from? Does it have a beginning? Was it always there?
No, I mean, if you ask string theorists, for sure they have an answer, because that's what string theory does. It proposes like, I don't know, 10 to the 500, no, I don't know. But like, it proposes like a lot of different particles that you can produce, especially like scalar particles like the inflaton. So I'm sure that there are many, many string motivated scenarios, but the problem is that as I was saying earlier, the inflaton is essentially a bit of an effective description. So you know that something similar to that must exist, but then you don't know exactly what that field is or where it comes from. It's, yeah, open to speculation. Yeah. I don't know, just... yes. Keep going.
Just so some excitation in that field, you really don't know what it was or what it represented in that early universe, like before inflation, in the inflaton field.
So you're asking, yeah, what happens before?
What was an excitation in that?
It's a quantum fluctuation.
Okay.
Yeah, it's simply the fact that you're dealing with quantum fields, and so these quantum fields are going to have some quantum fluctuations. It's just that the subsequent history would kind of, well, in our scenarios, would amplify the fluctuations, and you would be able to see these fluctuations in many different ways. But yeah, an imprint of these fluctuations is what happens in the CMB. Because what you see in the CMB is like very small, essentially, fluctuations, and those can be traced back to the inflationary fluctuations. Yeah. Yeah. If you have other questions, feel free to ask. No problem.
If there is no more questions, then I can stop for now. Let's thank Giorgio again.